Well, we're a little early. Is this too loud? Okay. We're a little bit early, but since everybody's being so quiet, I suppose we might as well go ahead and get started. I want to start out by thanking John and Edwin for taking over for me last week. They played a video. I hope you guys found it at least mildly entertaining. I noticed Edwin played the piano this morning. Did you guys see that? Is there nothing that Edwin can't do? I'm beginning to wonder. Anyway, so the thing was, and I don't know if you noticed, but you probably got out early. When I got back here, I went to the elders meeting, and I was told that there were people wandering in the hallways, and it was my fault. So that's because when I gave Edwin the times to edit the video, I gave him the wrong ones. My math isn't my strong point, and that became evident. So anyway, I do want to thank him for doing that, and let's just open up with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, as we come before you, we thank you for the opportunity to be here. We thank you for the word that we heard this morning, and we thank you for the knowledge that we can be adopted into the family of God and made joint heirs with Christ, Lord, through the work that he did on our behalf on the cross. And we're just so grateful for that. We're thankful for the ramifications of all that and what that means to us in knowing that he has overcome death, and so that we might as well. And we want to especially think about Stacy Valou this morning and just pray for him as he's in the hospital suffering from all that. And we continue to just lift him before you. And we just pray for your blessing now on this day and on this class and on the rest of the afternoon as well. Amen. Okay, so I did cut 10 minutes out of that video that I wanted to talk just a little bit about this morning before we get started. Now, I'm not sure if you can remember, I believe that he was in the middle of talking about baptism when the video ended. And I just wanted to sort of bring out some things after the time was cut, at least. I mean, I didn't I didn't watch the class, so I don't exactly know what happened. But I understand that where Edwin told me he cut it, where I told Edwin to cut it, rather. I just wanted to move just to bring up a few points that he brought up after that in the video. And the one thing that really struck me, and I don't know if he mentioned this before or not, but in the section afterwards, did he, in the early church at that time, at least in areas, baptism was preceded by 3 years of instruction, which I find interesting. You know, if somebody comes here to Southern View and is attending for a while and then makes a proclamation of faith, and you know, we welcome them into the church, and I think we wait a long time. Sometimes we'll wait 2-3 months, maybe sometimes even longer than that, before we start saying to them, hey, you know, the Bible says that if you're a believer, you should really follow the Lord in believer's baptism. And we do that, I think, for a specific reason, and that's because, you know, a lot of people get caught up in emotional things or different things like that, and they make a profession of faith when they may not be sincere. And so we don't really push people to do that very hard until they've been in attendance for a while and moving forward, you know, just to kind of see where they're at and make sure that their commitment is real. So we may wait 2, 3, 4, 5, sometimes even longer months before we really start saying, you know, the Lord commands you to do this, and you really need to think about following and being in obedience here. And then you have some churches, of course, who the day that you make a profession of faith will baptize you. They generally do that because they believe that it's baptism that saves you, or at least that's part of the process. But still, you can see the range here is that, you know, 1 day to several months. But in the early church, at least according to this guy that was speaking last week, they would wait 2 to 5 years before that, and had 2 to 5 years of instruction. Now, I would assume that the instruction was mostly doctrinal, but I can't help but think that at least part of that was because they wanted to look at the person's life and see, what was really going on. And I don't know if you've picked up on this or not. I really haven't stressed it too much, but one of the things that has really become clear to me in my study of the early church, we have this yeah, I'll skip that, but we have the early church, when we look at some of the things that they believed and some of the things that they did, we think that's weird, that's strange, and some of it we would just kind of flat disagree with. But one thing you have to acknowledge as you study the early church is that these people were dead serious about their Christianity. They were completely serious about it. They were not joking. They were not fooling around. There wasn't any room in those early churches for people who were lukewarm in their Christianity. You either had to be all in or not involved. And so I think that's kind of interesting. So the guy in the video went on to say that, and again, I think this is kind of interesting. So if you made it through the 5-year process or the 3-year process or whatever it was in order to get baptized, then when you went to actually do the deed, the first thing you did was you had the preparation for baptism included an entire day of fasting. Okay? You can look at me. I haven't fasted for an entire day in a long, long time, and I don't think I've ever done it voluntarily. But just again, you see the commitment to the thing here, and then after that, it was followed by an entire night of prayer. And I was thinking about this, and I kind of was laughing as Gary was talking this morning when he was talking about how we have trouble paying attention for 5 minutes or anything like that. And I'm getting to the point where I'm so influenced by YouTube Shorts now that my attention span's about 19 seconds, I think. And so I get confused when the guy doing the prayer goes for like 6 minutes. I have trouble following that, and I can't imagine what it would be like to sit and pray for an entire night. Stay up all night long praying in preparation for baptism, and yet that seems to be what they did. When they got done with that, then they would anoint the, I don't know what you call them, proselyte or the victim or whatever with oil, and then they would take him down into the baptismal thingy, whatever that was, and baptize him, immerse him, and most of the time anyway. And then when they would bring him back up out of there, and they would give him a new set of clothes or at least a white robe or something like that to wear. And then it seems like they would then all celebrate the Lord's Supper together with this guy. And that would be the first time this individual would be allowed to participate in communion. Now, I don't know if you picked up on it, but I'm pretty sure he told you in the video last week that the communion service was something, they had like a 2-tiered service where they would preach the word and maybe perhaps sing and do some other things, and that was open to everybody. But then after that was done, they would usher the non-church people out, and then they would hold the communion and the they would hold communion and the Lord's Supper in the kind of, not, I don't know if secret is the right word, but it wasn't open to everybody else. And so this would be the first opportunity that individual would have had to partake in the Lord's Supper. And, you look at this stuff and you kind of, you're thinking about what they did and why they did it, and it's kind of cool, it's kind of neat to look at that and to wonder why they did the things that they did in that way. And again, I would stress that this is representative. This isn't necessarily, this practice that this guy was talking about is not necessarily universal across the Roman Empire at this time, but it's representative of what those early churches were doing. But as I think about what they were doing, one thing that really strikes me is that this would have really, really clearly delineated, I think anyway, to people kind of on the periphery, a line between whether you were a believer or whether you weren't. or at least whether you were in the church or whether you weren't. You know, we live in a culture now where most everybody you're going to run into throughout the day probably believes that they're Christian. And they're Christian because either their parents were Christian or whatever, or you know, they're Christian because they're born in America, and America's a Christian nation, right? And so we've confused the idea of what it is actually to be a Christian. And you know, I had to travel with a guy just on Friday. You know, we were driving around in his truck and was talking to him, you know, and it's just interesting, you know. I know this guy would say he was a Christian. I know, and I think he sincerely believes it. He told me he was a Methodist, but he hasn't been to church, and he doesn't know how long, you know, and you know, his lifestyle doesn't reflect any kind of real. I mean, I think he's a good person, but it doesn't reflect any sort of spiritual depth or anything like that. And yet, you know, there's the absolute confidence that he's a believer. And you see that all over. You see that all over our world. We have that sort of easy approach to Christianity and to believing. And yet I would think if you had a church that practiced this kind of isolation, if you will, this kind of differentiation between who can take communion and, you know, what's involved in the baptism and all that you would narrow some of that down, and the confusion wouldn't be near as great, because you'd know. You know, if you were going to a church and they wouldn't let you take communion, you know, they wouldn't even let you get baptized, that would trigger bells in your head, right? And say, whoa, what's going on here? But, you know, on the other hand, and again, on the other hand, I would say this, that I'm guessing that the potential for somebody then to associate baptism and the Lord's Supper with actually being saved, you know, to say, well, if I could just make it to the point where I'm baptized into the church, if I can just make it to the point where they'll let me take communion, then that will be what saves me. I'm guessing the propensity for that sort of belief would be much greater in a church like that, which is indeed kind of what you see in some churches even today. So it's important to remember that the early church, you know, the things that they practiced and the things that they did, just because they practiced them and they did them doesn't necessitate that we do, right? It doesn't make them right or wrong necessarily, but Scripture is our guide. And what Scripture mandates, that's what we must do. And what Scripture doesn't speak on, we're free in Christ to do the way we want to. So I'm not advocating that this is the way to do anything or anything like that, but I do think it's just interesting to see what they did and think about why they might have done that. Did you have a question or a comment, Losanne? Right. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that kind of wraps up what I wanted you to see last week. And now this is the last week of our, I hope anyway, this is the last week of our class. It'll be surprising next week if it's not. I know that. So I just want to sort of finish up the day here by going through what I'm calling some odds and ends, and they're really just things that as I kind of studied through all this, you can't do church history not well anyway. Well, it's a question of whether it's been done well anyway, but I can't do church history the way I wanted to in 8 weeks, and I'm not advocating that I'm ready to do more. I'm just saying we didn't get as far as I thought. But I just wanted to go through some things with you that I saw here that either before I started and I wasn't clear about, or that I didn't know about, or that I was completely misinformed about. There's just a handful of things I wanted to talk to you about. So I hope these are going to be of interest to you, and I hope they're maybe informative as well. And the first thing, I kind of debated about this because I think it gets bandied about quite a bit, but Lois Ann kind of touched on it. The first thing I'm going to talk to you about is persecution in the early church. And so my question to you would be that when you think about persecution in the early church, what comes to mind? And this is always kind of what comes to my mind. It's a pretty graphic picture, really, but I mean, you see guys on fire here in the background and other guys waiting to be lit on fire, and then there's a group of believers praying there. That's kind of what my vision of church persecution is in the early church. And I don't know if that's what yours is, but I just kind of wanted to go through and talk about it just a little bit. So what do we really know about persecution of the early believers? Well, first of all, we know that biblically that persecution was expected, okay? In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus tells his followers there, don't be surprised, count it a blessing when you're reviled and cursed for my name. You know, that's going to happen. Excuse me. Again, and I wanted to read this one in Matthew 23, verses 34, I think, and 35. Jesus is talking to the Pharisees and the scribes and the Jewish leadership, and he says this. He says, therefore, behold, I'm sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah. And he goes on for that. And I just wanted to read that verse to you because I thought that was interesting. You know, sometimes we're tempted to think, why does God allow his people to be persecuted? And I think there's several reasons for that. But we see one right here. God allows the church to be persecuted for the purpose of bringing judgment on the ones who persecute. So sometimes we get caught up in this whole thing about, you know, God's only purpose is the salvation of mankind. And one of God's purposes is the salvation of mankind, but God's overarching purpose in the history of humanity is his own glory. And he will be glorified in judgment as well. We forget that sometimes. And the church is God's vehicle, his agent here on the earth, not only to be the body of Christ to the world and a Christian witness, but also it's to some extent, at least here we see, an agent for the condemnation of wickedness, right? Or I think I'm phrasing that wrong, but you get the picture. So anyway, we see that. Then, you know, again, in Luke, 2 Timothy, all throughout the Bible or the New Testament, we see that Christians should expect to be persecuted. That's part of the program. That's part of what's going on. We know that Jesus was persecuted. We know that the apostles were persecuted. We know that Stephen, in Acts chapter 3, other believers were persecuted, hauled out of their homes and thrown into prison. And so, you know, we need to be aware of that. We need to know that it happened. But it's interesting to note, in light of my picture here, that none of those circumstances that I just told you about, and when you read through the New Testament, if you look carefully at what's going on, you'll see that none of those are what we see here. This is state-sponsored persecution that we're seeing, these guys in a Roman Colosseum here. Okay? And that was not what was happening to the people that we read about in the New Testament. Now, they were being persecuted by the Jews, okay, which were religious, okay? And the Roman government was always looking for something to do, I guess, so they were none too happy to step in when they saw an opportunity and mete out punishment. But the actual persecution was coming from the Jews or from particular individuals or mobs in some places. But this wasn't what we see in the New Testament. There wasn't a systematic persecution by the Roman government of Christians. It came from essentially other religious people to various degrees. Okay? And another thing we need to keep in mind is that there's more than one type of persecution. This is state-sponsored persecution, but the majority of persecution that, oh, come on. Come on. What's that? If this is as bad as it gets for me, I'll deal with that. I thought we had this fixed. This is oh shoot, now I'm really screwed up. Hold on, bear with me, I'm sorry. I'm sorry? I can't hear what you're saying.
Just open your presentation. Yeah, you're there.
Oh. Looking, that may be easier said than done. I want to do this quickly because I don't want you guys to see how I spell. Yeah, I know. Okay. Yay. Okay, so this is the type of persecution most of us, most of the church throughout history is going to face. Have anybody ever seen this before? This is graffiti. You have? Somehow I knew. It is not. I thought the same thing, but this is not. This is graffiti that was found at a place called Palestine or Palatine Hill in Rome. It was taken off of a wall, and it depicts a guy in the act of worship, worshiping a figure that's on a cross with the head of a donkey. And the words say Alexamnos or something like that, worships his God. Okay? So this is the type of persecution, or is the other type of persecution. It's just personal, right? And this goes on all the time. This is what most of us will face. This is what most people in history have faced, okay? It's far more common than the state-sponsored persecution. But for our purposes here, I just want to kind of buzz through, because in my view of the early church, I think that the church was being persecuted by Rome all the time, and it's hard for me to envision how did the church even grow with that much persecution going on? How would anybody put up with that? I mean, if the picture we were looking at prior, if I knew that was my fate as a Christian, I don't know how I would deal with that. I don't know, and I don't know. Anyway, I'm babbling here, but I just want to talk about it. And the first thing I want to tell you is this: is that let's just say from 100 AD to 312 AD was the period in which most of the state-sponsored persecution happened. And one thing I would tell you is that it was neither constant at that time, nor was it universal throughout the Roman Empire. Okay? So the first round, I guess, of state-sponsored persecution, I'm sure you all are familiar with, and that's what they call the Neronic persecution, or the persecution that Nero brought. That's when Peter and Paul, we think, were killed under the Emperor Nero, and you've all heard the story that, I don't know how it happened, I don't think anybody really does, but part of Rome caught on fire and a significant portion of it burned. Nero, we do know that Nero blamed it, whether, for what reason we don't know, but he blamed it on the Christians. And so he started this persecution of Christians in and around Rome. Now, and I guess really throughout the empire, but keep in mind that Nero's in Rome, and the Roman Empire goes from nearly to Spain all the way around the Mediterranean to what is it now, Saudi Arabia, and then down into northern Africa. Right? So just because Nero decreed something in Rome doesn't mean it's happened in Alexandria. All right? And so for the most part, the state-sponsored persecution wasn't empire-wide, and it depended largely on the governors and the administrators of the areas that were being, affected. So you could have some guy that was a long way away who didn't care anything, and he might not be doing any kind of persecuting. So just kind of wanted to clarify that. So from Nero to the next sort of round of state-sponsored persecution was quite a lengthy bit of time, actually about 200 years. And I'm not telling you there was no persecution that went on of Christians then, but what I'm telling you is it wasn't mandated by the emperor of Rome, and it wasn't everywhere all at once. Again, there were individual pockets of areas where the governor or the prefect or whatever may decide I'm gonna go after these Christians, but it was isolated and not everywhere. I'm losing time here, and it's making me nervous. So. Remember that Christianity is very small. As a percentage. It's almost insignificant as part of the Roman Empire through this period. And so they're not looking at this as a threat. The Roman emperor or the government is not seeing Christians as a threat. What they're doing is treating Christianity like they would any other sect. It wasn't the persecutions that they had weren't related just strictly to Christianity, but it was all. They considered Christianity to be insane, and from time to time they would just go, any sect out there that was doing something sort of countercultural, whatever, they would persecute from time to time. The rule was you had to worship the emperor. There was emperor worship at this time, and if you wouldn't worship the emperor, they would kill you. They'd give you the chance to recant, and if you wouldn't do it, then they tortured you and killed you. And that's kind of what the Christians kind of fell under. They obviously wouldn't worship the emperor, and so when that came to light, they were persecuted. There was an emperor, or not an emperor, excuse me, a prefect in Asia, okay, by the name of, I think it's called Pliny. I think it's pronounced Pliny, Pliny, and they have a letter from him to the emperor, who's a guy named Trajan. Okay, and he writes to him and he says, just to demonstrate what I'm telling you, he says, hey, I got this group here, and he calls them, he says, they're insane. They follow this guy. They think they have a God who raised from the dead. I've been torturing these people and doing different things to them, trying to get them to confess what they do. And I really can't find that they're doing anything wrong, but they refuse to worship the emperor. This is my standard practice. I just want to know what you think of it. He says, when I find them, I give them a chance to recant. If they won't recant, then I kill them. And Trajan, who's the emperor, writes back and says, you're doing exactly the right thing. Don't go looking for them. But if you find them, then get rid of them. Okay? So that was kind of the attitude. Anyway, so we go from there to about 250 AD, a guy named Decius. He's a Roman emperor. There's actually three of them. Decius is succeeded by a guy named Trebonius, or something like that, and then another guy named Valerian. Okay, so for about 10 years here, you have these three guys reigning, and they actually issue a decree, or the first guy, Decius does, issues a decree that's empire-wide, that everybody in the empire has to sacrifice to the pagan gods for the good of Rome. Okay, so you got to go in here, you got to sacrifice to them. When you do that, they give you a little piece of paper that says, this is what I did, and when you get that piece of paper, you're safe. Well, the Christians obviously couldn't do that, and so he really starts going after. Now, this is empire-wide, all over the empire. He is, again, the empire is a big place, and they don't have the internet, so things are, can be spotty, but empire-wide, he is pushing after these Christians, because now this is for the benefit of Rome, right? Rome is under pressure from forces outside, and he wants you to sacrifice to the gods on behalf of Rome, and they won't do it. So they're kind of seen now as a threat to the empire, and so he really begins to crack down on them. Okay, that goes on for about 10 years, and then there's a few years of peace, and then a guy named Diocletian comes by. This is about 306, 302, something like this. I can't remember. Diocletian wasn't an emperor for very long, very short period of time. But this is probably the worst of the official persecutions. Apparently, he hates Christians for some reason. And he does the same thing. He goes after them throughout the empire. And it results in not now this time we steps it up a notch. It's not only I find them and I kill them, but I take their property, I give it to other people or destroy it, and he purposely goes after the Christian writings. He goes after the scriptures and tries to destroy as much of that as he possibly can. Okay? To some extent, his successors continued the policies, but this is right. Constantine is going to become emperor, and in 313, he does away with the persecution for any religion empire-wide. Okay? So it doesn't last terribly long, but it is pretty bad. It's interesting to note that during this time, you get this group of people that come forward. They're practicing what we call now voluntary martyrism, right? Where they're actually going up. They want to become martyrs. That's their goal. And so there was one, I read this kind of interesting story. They went to a Roman prefect in some region and said, hey, we're Christians, we want to be martyred. And so, he's, okay, that's fine. So he martyrs a handful of them, and then more of them come up, and he gets so sick of doing it, he just says, look, there's enough rope or cliffs around, if you want to kill yourself, you just go do it and leave me alone. So it's kind of weird to note that, but I mean, so what I'm guessing here is that just like anything, people start getting carried away with stuff, and they start viewing this act of martyrdom as the road to self-righteousness. That would be my guess. I don't know that. I'm guessing, but at any rate, we got to move on here. Okay, so after Constantine comes in, he outlaws persecution of any group of people for any religion, and so the Christians enjoy relative peace. This is, again, about 312, 313 AD. From then on, there's occasional sporadic persecutions of Christians, but again, because some of the emperors after Constantine were actually Arians, and so they would persecute the non-Arian church. I don't know if you remember, but we talked about Arianism as a heresy in the first few weeks. But as Christianity gains stature now in the Roman Empire, at least in the western half of the Roman Empire, because the empire is split at this time, I would assume that and persecution, state persecution is no longer valid, that even probably to some extent the individual persecution began to lessen. Interesting enough, that's not the case in the eastern half of the empire, which we'll talk about actually here next, but a few things to note. It was not uncommon for Christians under persecution to lapse or to recant their Christianity. But you can kind of see that. But this is going to lead to big problems and now keep in mind, we're talking about a whole range of time, right? From 100 AD or maybe even earlier than that, from say 70 AD to 312. Okay, you have, again, little pockets of persecution. So Christians recanting and then wanting to get back into the church creates an issue that the church is going to have to deal with. And some of the things that we see today even are affected by that. Some Christians would flee persecution. If I'm getting persecuted here in Ethiopia or whatever, then I'm just going to leave and go to Egypt or whatever. And that became an issue, because there was a group of people that, like our voluntary martyrs here, who said, no, that's wrong. You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't flee. And other people saying, I don't know about that. So that became a source of division in the church. Have you ever heard the story about the Christians worshiping in the Roman catacombs because of persecution? Maybe you haven't. I've always heard that. Apparently that's not true. The Christians, there's no evidence that the Christians ever met for any great period of time or on a regular basis in the Roman catacombs. There was a high regard for martyrs at this time and for martyrdom, which led to a sort of an annual remembrance of the martyrs, which then led to a veneration of the martyrs. And that's how we get, our saint this day and saint that day and saint other guy day. It all came out of those, and what you have here then is the martyrs starting to be worshipped. Persecution wasn't always, and maybe not even usually, to the death. okay? Admittedly, torture and slavery and work camps don't sound like a great alternative to me, but just so you know, not everybody who got persecuted was killed. And then here's an interesting sort of tidbit that you don't get out of church history, but I just ran across. I have no idea if this is true or not, but it sounds good, so I'm going to tell it to you. There's at least a school of thought out there that thinks that with the advent of communism and different things like that, that there have actually been more Christians killed since 1900 than there were in the 19 centuries before that. So just for what it's worth. Okay, why were they persecuted? They were seen as antisocial because I think much more so than today, they refused to be a part of the culture around them. The gladiatorial games, they would not take part in, and the theater, they would not. The theater was immoral and it's kind of like our theater today, actually. But they wouldn't take part in it. They just wouldn't go. And so that was seen, they wouldn't do that. So that they were seen as antisocial. And so it was like, what do we do with antisocial? Well, you know this from the playground, right? You got an antisocial person, you beat them up, take their lunch money. That's just what we do as humans. So there you have it. They were seen at some point as a threat to an empire because they would not acknowledge the dominance of the emperor. They were regarded as atheists. They lived in a polytheistic society, and they advocated for one God only, and so they were seen as atheists. And then they were easily slandered because, again, they had these services that they would kick all the unbelievers out of so that they could practice their baptism and communion and things like that. And so they easily came under the idea of slander. They were thought to be cannibals. They were thought to be living immorally, and they were thought to be revolutionary, which in some ways they were. Okay? The one thing I would say, I think Lois Ann kind of pointed this out earlier, is that persecution purified the church. I mean, you can see that. That's just common sense, right? But it also provided an excellent platform for evangelism. When you got this guy and this group of people, and you're saying, worship our gods, or we're going to kill you, or do whatever, and he says, listen, your gods are wood and stone. My God's alive. I'm not going to worship your guys, your gods, even at the point of death. If you're watching this, that's got to make you think, because at some level, these guys had to know, right? This is wood and stone. And so it provided an excellent platform for evangelism. Okay, let's move on. You've got to be kidding me. So this is a nice picture of a bunch of, they look like the Muslim buildings, okay? Only there's crosses on the top. Do you know what they are? Yeah. Isn't that weird? Right? I don't know. I call them Muslim buildings. It's things you see over in Russia, with the funny cone shapes. Okay? It's the Eastern Orthodox Church. Yeah, you know anything about the Eastern Orthodox Church? I thought that was a branch of Catholicism. Okay? I knew nothing about it. Well, it turns out it's not. Okay? The Eastern Orthodox Church is composed of a whole bunch of sort of united, it's kind of like the IFCA sort of for Eastern churches, I guess. It's a whole bunch of different groups of churches, I guess, that are united under this name. I mean, there's the Russian Orthodox, the Ethiopian, the Greek Orthodox. The list goes on and on. I mean, there's a bunch, and I was just frankly too lazy to list them all out for you. But they don't recognize a single leadership as authoritative like the Pope. They don't recognize him. But they do recognize the Bishop of Constantinople as sort of the first among equals. Okay, so he doesn't have authority over the rest of the churches, but they all sort of give some credence, more credence to him than they do anybody else. They deal with icons a lot. There's a lot of icons in the Eastern Orthodox Church, which we would regard as idolatrous. They do not, okay? And again, this is a kind of a giant wormhole to go down, but so I don't want to spend a lot of time, especially because we're running out of it. But the Eastern Orthodox Church, okay, remember Diocletian, the guy who started that big persecution, he was the first one to sort of divide the emperor. And then when Constantine came in, he sort of solidified that. He had a Western capital in Rome and an Eastern capital in Constantinople, what was previously known as Byzantium, and now which we know, we would call that the Byzantine Empire now. Okay, those Eastern churches were all part of that. And when Rome fell in, I don't know, what was it, 360 or 496 or something like that, somewhere in the third or fourth or fifth century, when Rome fell, remember the church, the Western church, then kind of filled that power vacuum. And they became not only the spiritual leaders, but sort of the political leaders. And the Roman bishop then began to assert his authority and say, hey, you guys all got to listen to me. Well, the Eastern Orthodox, the Eastern churches, Jerusalem and Ephesus and all those places, they said, go pound sand. You're not any better than we are. Okay? Maybe not in those exact words, but the point is that a rift started. Okay, when the Roman bishops began to claim authority over them, and as time went on, they just got worse and worse and worse. And as the Roman bishops began to take more and more opportunity to assert their authority, the Greek Orthodox, or not the Greek Orthodox, but the Eastern Orthodox Church, the rift got bigger and bigger until finally in like 1054, they split entirely, said, we're sorry, we don't have anything to do with you, you don't have anything to do with us, and that's the way it went. So that went on, that eastern part, that how do you say that? Byzantine Empire? Byzantine Empire lasted, this is the Roman Empire, lasted for another 1,000 years until somewhere around 1500, right, when the Ottoman Turks finally took it over and pushed the Orthodox churches. Well, they didn't push them out. They stayed there. They're still there at this time, which, of course, if you think about what might have happened, I mean, the Eastern Church has undergone a lot more persecution than the Western Church because they had to deal first with the Persians and then with Islam and all of that stuff. And so they've been being persecuted for a long time. And I just wanted to get to this as interesting before we run out of time. So when Islam first takes over, right, it's a bunch of sort of tribal stuff, different factions, and they're not really all together. And so they don't take over all at once, but it takes them several hundred years before they work their way up from North Africa and around and all that stuff into Asia, what we would call Turkey today, and finally take over the city of Constantinople. When they do, all of those religious scholars from the east flee to the west. When they do that, they bring with them their manuscripts. So sometime, I think Gregory III, Pope Gregory III, we talked about him some time ago. He was a kind of a nasty guy, but he mandated that all of the church services, all of the literature, everything in the West be in Latin. Okay, so that's all that the Latin church has for several hundred years. That's all the Western church has for several hundred years. When these Eastern scholars come over and bring these Greek manuscripts, that opens up a whole new world to the Bible translators, okay? And so now they can take these Greek manuscripts and compare them with their Latin manuscripts. And in many cases, the Greek manuscripts are much old. Well, in all cases, they are much older. And they can see the different translations. And this is one of the factors that led to the Reformation, because they started getting better translations of the Bible from this migration of Eastern academics, I guess, if you want to call them that. Anyway, we got to go. We can't spend any more time here. So the next thing is the Crusades, and we're not going to be able to spend much time on those, and you can't see the picture anyway. So here's the Crusades in a nutshell. I didn't know much about this. I learned it all from Hollywood and what I saw on television and read in fiction books. So when Islam began to take over in the palace, and I'm not telling you that. This is what I really learned. It's got to be true because I got it off the internet. So when Islam began taking over in Palestine, And actually, when they worked their way even all the way up through Asia, the Christians in the West were still traveling down to the Holy Land for their little pilgrimages and different things, right? To do penance and different stuff like that. And for most of the time, for 400 years or so, it was a fairly peaceful situation. Sometimes you get a different faction that would take over and they wouldn't let the Christians in. But for most of the part, the Christians were free to come and go and see these sites. Now, the Muslims took over some of the sites and made them their own, different things like that. There was some friction, but people were traveling back and forth. But the Christians began to send because, I don't know, one of the popes sort of started pushing this, and so the Christians, the groups began to get larger and larger and larger, and into the thousands coming down there. So I don't know if this is why, but you can kind of think that maybe that's why the Muslims begin to say, wait a minute, we don't want to do this. And so they begin to stop some of these groups, and that caused friction, and so then the popes started saying, you can't do that. These are our sites. And the Muslims saying, no, they're not. They're our sites. And things got bad. And then they got worse. And eventually it became all-out war. And the Pope started saying, we get around 1,000 something, we got to go get our sites back, essentially. And interestingly enough, the first crusade was what they call the Peasants' Crusade. Some hermit, guy named Peter the Hermit, he started this crusade. He got a bunch of peasants together, and they all started going down to the Holy Land. They're going to recapture it. Well, they never made it to the Holy Land. They only got just a little bit further than Constantinople. And Peter, he's not a natural leader. He's a hermit, right? But he gets all these German peasants, and they're going down there and loses control of them. They're ransacking everything. The Eastern churches are down there. They're going through them and pillaging them and doing all kinds of stuff. It's just crazy, right? But anyway, just a little bit south of Constantinople, they run into some real warriors and they get completely wiped out. So that kind of sets the tone, and it's we got to go avenge these guys and do all this. Anyway, there's 7 different crusades, major crusades that go on during the next 1,000 years or so, or maybe not that long, 400. But during this time, they go down there. Their purpose is to recapture the Christian sites, to enforce the authority of the Pope over the Eastern churches, and then to drive the Muslims out, essentially, none of which they accomplished. Okay. Not only that, but it's also seen that Pope Leopold II or something like that comes out and says, hey, here's the deal. If you go on a crusade, that's automatic go to heaven. Your sins are forgiven. So, there's a whole religious, remember that at this time, the Catholic Church is both, there's both the political authority and the spiritual authority. Okay, so there's people that would argue that it's not there's kings and stuff in the West, but there's a very blurry line between the Pope and the king. There's this constant friction about who's in charge. Anyway, the crusades go on. There's, like I say, there's 7 different ones, major crusades, but even in between all the crusades, there's people going down there. So there's constant fighting. And the crusaders, when they go down there, they are just laying waste, okay? They attack a city, they don't leave anybody alive. This includes Constantinople. Constantinople, when they first start out, is still under the control of the Eastern Roman Empire. It's still nominally Christian. They don't care. They go down there, they ransack Constantinople. So they create a tremendous amount of animosity and hard feeling in the act of the Crusades, and it just doesn't turn out well for anybody. So not exactly what you see on TV, but and then I was going to talk to you about the about the Inquisition in general. Just give me 3 minutes. We're going to be over a little bit. The Inquisition. Do any of you know much about that? No. Dang it, maybe I better shut up. The Inquisition is, I would read you the notes, but we're in a hurry. So the Catholic Pope, he starts getting worried about heresy. So he says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to send out these, and first thing he does is send out a mandate to all his bishops and say, you go around to all the people that you're in charge of and find out what they believe. And if they are heretics, then I want you to excommunicate them. Starts out pretty mild, as most things do, and then it begins to build. So after him, the next pope comes along and says, well, that's not good enough. I'm going to send out these inquisitors, and they're going to do the interviewing. okay? And they're going to find out what's going on. And then this particular pope decides, you know what, not only that, but I'm going to make it, they're finding heresy. These people don't believe what I want them to believe, and so I'm going to say it's illegal for anybody but the church to have a copy of the scriptures. Okay? So now the inquisitors are not just looking for heretical views, and by heretical I mean not Catholic, okay? They're not just looking for those views, but if you've got a copy of the scriptures, you're a heretic right off the bat, right? And then after that it becomes, okay, so it's going to be okay to torture these heretics. And it just goes on and on. So the Inquisition started out as a defense against heresy from the Catholic perspective, from the Pope's perspective. And it started out fairly small with, you're going to be excommunicated if you don't believe what we believe, and got to the point where during the Spanish Inquisition 200 years later, they're just torturing and murdering people all over the place. So I know I didn't do that justice, but we are out of time. I would like to leave with this one thought, okay? They think, they estimate, and who they is, I couldn't tell you, but they estimate that there was about 250,000 people killed. Now, and keep in mind, the people that were killed were people who didn't agree with Catholic doctrine. Okay, so that would include all of you if you were there. You would all be heretics. You would all be tortured and killed if they found that out, okay? So I'm just throwing that out there. But about 250,000 people, they think, between the Crusades and the Inquisition were killed, which is just an amazing number, terrible number, okay? Well, again, just to put that in perspective, since the turn of the 20th century, with the onset of communism and different philosophies like that, there's been millions of people killed by atheistic philosophy. So when you hear people out there and they throw this in your face, saying, you religious people, you had the Crusades, you had the Inquisition, you had all these things where you were doing this. That's true, and those were tragedies. That was sin. That was awful, awful stuff. But it pales, just a drop in the bucket compared to what's been done in the name of atheism. So that's going to bring us to 2 minutes after actually the end of our class. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, consider teaching the next few thousand years yourself. Oh, it's business meeting tonight too. If you can make it, it'd be appreciated.